Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I have a terrific panel here with me. I'm not going to spend time introducing them in full because you all have your programs. But let me begin with the Minister of Commerce and Industry from India, who we're delighted to have with us today, Mr. Piyush Goyal. Minister, if you could share with us India's perspective of these trends. India obviously has played a very significant role within the WTO historically and in the Doha round. And so when we look at the WTO and the challenges of making it relevant and viable again, very interested in your views. And also it was quite striking that India walked away from the agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which took some steps towards being finalized this past November in Bangkok, and India stepped outside of that. And if you could share with us what India's thinking is about regional trade agreements in the multilateral trade system.
Thank you, Amy, and a warm welcome to all the participants who have come from different parts of the world and our Member of Parliament from Germany. At the outset, India very strongly believes in multilateralism. But I think the subject at hand today targets one individual quite unfairly. I think it may make good copy for newspaper and may make nice headlines. But what I believe President Trump did is just a wake-up call. It's not as if these problems were not existing before. It's not as if multilateralism or WTO was performing very well or very, very efficiently. Over the years, we've seen cracks developing in the free trade as it was originally envisaged. Very clearly, countries were putting up borders to trade. There was a huge element of unfair trade practices that were there, possibly may not have been as openly discussed, but the subtext of free trade was clearly missing. And to my mind, in the new normal as you suggested, while there may be some uncertainties, these trade wars may lead to some kind of upheaval in the short run. In the long run, this debate that has happened over the last 3 years, in the long run, this concern around trade deficits, in the long run, this concern about reciprocal and fair access on both sides is something that augurs well for the world. It augurs well for more fair trade practices amongst countries. We in India have clearly faced discrimination, clearly faced a lot of unfair trade practices from different countries around the world. We are in the process of bringing out all of these issues, bringing them in the right perspective, placing them before our trading partners ourselves. That was one of the reasons that we were not able to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because very clearly the partnership was not amongst equals. One will have to recognize that any arrangement, any multilateral, regional, comprehensive or international arrangement will have to recognize the realities of different geographies, different sizes of the countries, different populations, different political systems of governance, different levels of prosperity. Unless we factor in all of these and then create a far more rules-based multilateral trading system, I think logically what happened 3 years ago would have happened possibly 5 years later, but by then things would have gone very much out of hand. I think it's a good wake-up call for all of us around the world. At least we in India are finding some of these issues to be very relevant to our trading with other countries and our trading concerns with other countries. And I believe that in India there is a thing called Manthan. Manthan is what happened when there was a lot of turmoil and upheaval in mythology in the old days. And it is believed in India that after this turmoil, what emerges will always be good for humanity. And I'm very optimistic, I'm very confident that all that we see today is only going to be for the better of multilateralism, what my Prime Minister called in the last BRICS conference, reformed multilateralism is what this world is looking for.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Can you say a few words about India's decision to not join the RCEP?
Well, RCEP as a formulation had 16 countries, most of whom already had trading arrangements intersay each other. So India had a trading arrangement with ASEAN countries. We had trading arrangements with Korea and Japan already. New Zealand was a very small player in our trade basket. Australia is an important player, but we have a very few defined items. And intersay Australia and India, we really don't have any problems in even expanding our trade. But we also had China in that room, with whom we have very serious concerns about the way they are carrying out their trade, about the way Chinese ecosystem is locked down for fair trade practices with other countries. And we in India have found that, I'll give you a small statistic. Between 2003-4 and 13-14, in 10 years, our trade deficit with the RCEP countries grew 10 times, from barely $7 billion to about $65-70 billion. Today, I have a trade deficit of $105 billion, which is more than 2/3 of my world trade deficit with the RCEP countries. And a lot of it, when I go into detail, comes because of lack of fair access in these countries to Indian products. It's because of lockdown in one way or the other, through non-tariff measures, through different practices that are carried out by these countries. We were not able to get fair access for our industry. Services, in any case, is an area which is very important for India. And the services was a low ambition agreement in RCEP. And end of the day, on balance, I realized and my government realized that this would be only to the detriment of India's domestic industry to get into the RCEP unless we got credible, fair and accountable resolution of our concerns around circumvention of product origin rules, around the base year from which this agreement would take off, about the effort by different countries to give good access, fair access to my products or Indian products, about the collective effort of all countries to help us bridge this huge 105 billion trade deficit that India is carrying with the RCEP countries. I think the other countries were not in a position in the short time frame to resolve all these issues. And it would have been possibly a good diplomatic move, but certainly a bad trade decision to be a part of RCEP. And I think trade will have to stand on its own legs and cannot be dictated purely by diplomatic concerns.
Let me move to the audience for question and answer. And as tradition at Raishina Dialogue, I'm going to turn to young leaders first and take a couple of questions from you, which we'll then pose to the audience, and then we'll pose to our panel, and then we'll go to the broader audience. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Mithali Mukherjee. I'm from India. I'm seeking the Commerce Minister's views on 2 points. Jeff Bezos from Amazon is in India currently, sadly not at Raisina. He has committed $1 billion to India. Even as he does that, a traders association that represents 70 million traders claims that Amazon has been indulging in false practices and flouting the FPI rules. I'm wondering how India can incubate investment in a scenario where there is strong domestic pushback. That's point one. The second point, Commerce Minister, is with regards to our imports. In 2019, we imposed trade curbs on Malaysia. We are reportedly considering that for Turkey as well, and you have indicated that you might be considering putting some kind of restrictions on imports in the others category that translates to about $100 billion. I'm wondering what signal that sends out to the global community when we are putting these riders down in terms of our imports. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, you spoke about Amazon, and I would assume you're talking about the e-commerce ecosystem as a whole. Whether Mr. Bezos is here or no is not for me to decide. That's for the organizers to take a call. But the reality is that very recently I read that the Competition Commission of India, based on their preliminary findings, has already initiated an inquiry into the business practices of Amazon I don't know whether Amazon or both Amazon and Flipkart. And that is certainly an area of concern for every Indian. We did allow e-commerce entities to come into India in the marketplace model. A marketplace model, just so that we are all on the same page, is an agnostic platform where buyers and sellers are free to trade, come onto the platform for what they want to buy. Sellers are free to offer their products. And if buyers and sellers agree, then the transaction is between the seller and the buyer. The marketplace cannot own the inventory, cannot have control on the inventory, cannot determine prices, cannot have algorithms to determine which product will get a preeminent position or would be given a market preference when offered to the buyers. There are several established rules of a marketplace. I think as long as everybody follows those rules, we very much welcome e-commerce into India, and they're happy to come and trade and serve the people of India. We have very strict rules about FDI in multi-brand retail, where only 49% is allowed. And anybody who tries to use the e-commerce marketplace model to get into the multi-brand retail space surreptitiously will have to be questioned and will have to be investigated. Whether they are doing that or not is a matter for the investigators to decide. It's not my call. I think we leave that job to the persons who are expected to look at the business practices of different companies, and whatever would be their findings should be respected by everybody. But I have on more than one occasion, including in this very room, maybe 6 or 7 times, said this to the people of India and to all investors, that please follow the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Don't try to find loopholes within the defined letter of the law alone, when very clearly we have articulated what the e-commerce marketplace model is. Secondly, they may have put in $1 billion, but then if they make a loss of $1 billion every year, then they jolly well have to finance that $1 billion. So it's not as if they're doing a great favor to India when they invest $1 billion. They are investing money over the last few years, also in warehousing and certain other activities, which is welcome, which is good. But if they are bringing in money largely to finance losses, and those losses in an e-commerce marketplace model, a fair marketplace model in a turnover of $10 billion, if you're going to have a loss of $1 billion, $1.5 billion, it certainly raises questions where the loss came from. How can a marketplace make such a big loss unless they're indulging in predatory pricing or some unfair trade practices? These are real questions which will need answers, and I'm sure the authorities who are looking at it will seek those answers, and I'm sure the e-commerce companies will have their say on that. I don't think we have put any curbs on imports from Malaysia. Neither are we contemplating that. Nor have we put any curbs on Turkey. Nor are we contemplating that. India believes in fair play and equal treatment to all. Any curbs that we put in the best interest of India's trade and international trade, apply to all countries uniformly. And if some of the restrictions impact Malaysia, I don't think that would be the only country that is impacted. There would be other exporters to India who would have the same impact. And lastly, to your question about others category, the idea came to me from the Germans who were in the room when we were having our quality conclave yesterday. We have 1 out of 4 items, nearly $100 billion of imports, actually more, about $130 billion of imports being categorized in the HSN code as others. Now, we don't know what those others are. We have no way to verify what is the product that's coming into the country amongst the various lines in that code. And I think it's only fair, and the German friends said that in their country, they just don't allow anybody to bring anything in the others category. I think I've been trying for the last 6 months to assess what does India import. And every time I try to do that, I'm stonewalled with a huge number of others. I think it's only fair that all importers categorize that product in an HSN code. If there is a product which doesn't get fit into any of those codes, I've simultaneously announced that please approach us. we'll create new codes or we'll expand the existing codes. But I think it's every nation's right, and for that matter, duty as Commerce Minister to my people to know what is being imported into the country. It also opens up opportunity for other countries. Suppose I'm getting a product, let's say from Singapore, in the others category. Maybe somebody from Germany or somebody from the US or somebody from UK may like to offer that product also to India at better and competitive terms. Maybe somebody in India may want to start producing that product. I think it's important that we know exactly what is being imported, whether it's being imported at the right classification, and open the market up to other players so that there's more transparency. This is a move towards transparency and more fair trading practices.
Sir, my question is to Mr. Commerce Minister. As Indian economy is not growing as predicted, and on the other hand, organizations including World Bank downgraded growth projection from 6.5 to 5%. So, sir, my question is, how can we achieve 5 trillion economy by 2024? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question back there. Yes, sir?
Thank you. Yeah. So the question is to Minister Goyal and Director Poon. So over the years, we have seen a consistent trend from countries moving from multilateral organizations such as WTO, multilateral trade deals such as TPP and RCEP, to bilateral platforms such as Indo-US deal, as echoed by your leadership. So do you think that this trend is going to continue over the years and it's going to intensify?
Okay, let me take one more question. This gentleman here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Patrick Kugiel from the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw. Since there was already mentioned the negotiations ongoing for the last 13 years.
What's this question to? We didn't figure out.
This is the question to Indian Minister.
And this is also for you, this question.
I'm
yes.
not able to understand.
Okay.
You'll have to be a little more.
Go ahead.
It was already mentioned that there are ongoing negotiations between the European Union and India on the ambitious free trade agreement. So I would like to ask you to tell us what's the current status of those negotiations, and if you see any prospects for concluding those negotiations in a foreseeable future. And in addition to this, if you can tell us also your take on whether you consider seriously FTA with the United States at this
Whether
moment.
I consider?
An FTA with the United States. So we'll go to you first, Minister. You have the question about growth. Is India moving more from multilateral regional trade agreements to bilateral trade agreements, and specifically India-EU, India-US FTAs?
Since this subject has already been addressed, I'll focus on what was raised about India. Certainly, growth in India has seen a slowdown in the last few quarters, but it's a part of the international or the global interconnections that India also is now suffering from global challenges, uncertainties. Within the country also, I think over a period of time, certain issues that came to fore. For example, environmental issues caused us to take a call that we'll move to BS6, which is a more environmentally friendly, efficient standard for our auto industry. Now that has pulled back the growth in the auto industry in the last year and a half. And while they're resetting their technologies to go towards BS6, the customer base also is slowing down its purchases so that they'll take a more modern or a better vehicle once you have a fuel efficient or environmentally friendly vehicle. Similarly, we've been cleaning up our banking system. We've been trying to clean up a lot of irregularities in the real estate sector. And this is a period again of churn, which does cause a short-term pain or some stresses in the economy. But I personally believe that in the long run, we are moving towards a situation that the world recognizes India as a fair place to do business in, as an honest economy, where everybody gets equal opportunity. There's no rent seeking, there's no favors to one set of people over the other. And I think this churn will do India in the long run a lot of good. As far as moving out of multilateralism is concerned, that's absolutely not the intention. Moving out of RCEP had its own very well-defined reasons. We are very much a part of WTO. We are very much wanting to strengthen WTO along with other stakeholders. In fact, we were amongst the first four countries to pay all our dues to WTO. I think many of the other countries have still not paid even their dues to WTO. And we believe that India will have to protect its interests, whether it's a bilateral agreement or a multilateral agreement. Bilaterally, there's an advantage that what I had mentioned earlier about different geographies, different political environments, different levels of prosperity, income levels. For example, the farmers in India at an average have a hectare or two on which they are cultivating. Hence, productivity is low, costs are high, efficiencies are stressed. But if I have to compete with a farmer in Russia, a farmer in Brazil, a farmer in the United States, who has 1,000 hectares or 5,000 hectares. In Russia, I met somebody the other day who had 100,000 hectares. Now, that's a very unfair competition. And in a bilateral agreement, we can try and address those unfair differences in trade. In multilateral arrangements, there will always be a stress that we may not be able to address all these concerns because the countries on the other side have very, very different levels of prosperity and population and their own circumstances. As far as the EU is concerned, we are waiting for the EU to take charge. We have had very, very positive interactions with Germany, for example, with France, with several other countries who are very keen that India and EU enter into at least to begin with a PTA, maybe moving towards an FTA. And I'm looking forward to my engagement with the EU Commission, the new commission that's just come into play. We are very keen to pursue that dialogue further. Earlier, the dialogue was stalled largely on wines, spirits, and automobiles. I think those are not as contentious issues today. However, issues around agriculture, issues around non-tariff barriers, the TBTs and SPS protocols, those will also find center stage in any new negotiations that we do, bilaterally or multilaterally with any countries. With the US, we are at an advanced stage of dialogue to sort out some of the pressing issues. But certainly, I do believe that at some stage, India and the United States, both of us are very culturally, historically, both large, flourishing democracies, are right partners, trading partners, who can expand trade, who can work with each other. And I would believe that going forward, both countries would like to further expand our engagement, which could lead to PTAs and FTAs in the years ahead.
We are almost out of time. I just want to give our panelists just one more opportunity to say, a line or two of additional thoughts they may have. We haven't really been able to touch on what the decoupling trend might mean for other countries in Southeast Asia or India or other countries if we have bifurcated supply chains and different technological systems. And we haven't been able to talk that much about how the global trade agreements can be used to tackle sustainable development, including things like water resources and transnational water management issues. So if you have any thoughts about that or any takeaway thoughts from the conversation so far, this is your opportunity to share with us. Jeff, can I turn to you first?
I'm going to say what I said before. On China, while there is a sense to decoupling at very high levels of technology, and maybe we can be successful there and effective, we're not at the end of history with China. And the fact that 25 years of constructive engagement hasn't worked doesn't mean we shouldn't have more of an element of that involved. On the broader trade scenario, I see very rough seas ahead, and it's hard for me to see bringing in issues like sustainable development or whatever into a system that is being tested at the edges. The United States has taken a range of actions unilaterally, calling it national security, like auto, steel, and aluminum, which allows the United States to say that these are exemptions from the WTO. And I think if they go down that road, and if there's a second term for the president, I think we may be headed to very rough seas where the system breaks apart.
Okay, thank you. One comment? No? Okay, Minister?
Well, I think since I also handle railways in India, and I use a lot of couplers in the train system that I run. I think rather than just focusing on decoupling, it's time all of us started addressing the issue of recoupling. Well, there are certain challenges which have come to fore. The iceberg is now kind of out in the open. And I think all of us will have to start addressing these issues, whether it's data, whether it's trade, whether it's investments, whether it's immigration, whether it's services. All of these issues will now be recoupled with newer ways of looking at things. I think all countries are becoming very conscious of fair play, which is why I said we need a reformed multilateralism around the world. The United States and India are quite aligned in our thinking in terms of trading practices over the last several decades, having got into some kind of a situation which needs to be relooked at, reassessed, to ensure not only fair play inter se countries, but fair play inter se people. So we'll have to make trade policies more and more people-centric as we go forward. And when we are talking of people-centric policies, it'll look at sustainability, it'll look at elimination of poverty, bringing up levels of prosperity in the less developed world. I think all of these will be real issues that the world will have to address.
Thank you. Alexander?
I completely agree that we have to tackle all these challenges, and I believe that's what multilateral organizations such as the WTO are for. I'm not a big fan of the idea of pressing all these things into a trade agreement. A trade agreement is supposed to be a trade agreement, so we shouldn't put all the other things that are very necessary, and on the state level we have to negotiate them and we have to find contracts for them, but I don't think a free trade agreement or trade agreement is the right contract to put in all these things. Let me take a model, probably Australia. They were very present also at this conference. They have their disputes with China, like all of us, but they have quite a well-going trade. Why? Because they have a very thin, tiny little trade agreement, and that adds up to being the most important trade partner with China from their side. And I think that's the way to go. So I'm not a big fan of the European way of putting everything into a comprehensive agreement, and then in the end, not getting it ratified because there's 28, well, end of this month, 27 states not getting to a point of it, and that's not the right way to tackle the things, I think.
Can I just supplement what he said? I agree with him. You can't get everything into a trade agreement, but all the tracks need to be negotiated simultaneously. Otherwise, what we find is that trade takes center stage, where certain countries may be at a disadvantage, but other areas, so every country has a comparative advantage in some field or the other. Every country can't do everything. So we may have an advantage on services. We don't have investment surplus. Maybe Germany or America has huge amounts of money that they're looking at avenues to invest. So they want concessions on the investment side, but we may want certain concessions on the services side. So when you negotiate all tracks simultaneously, there's greater degree of possibility that you'll be able to get fair play in international trade or international negotiations.
Okay, very good point to end on. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a lively discussion. Thank you very much.